be really great. Thanks so much. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Debbie Nelson with Together SC and the Knowledge Network. We are so delighted to have all of you here today on a Wednesday at noon. And I have the great pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, who's a good friend and someone I have the utmost respect for. Our friend Jessica Sharp is joining us today. For those of you that are meeting her for the first time, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about Jessica. She is the founder and CEO of Sharp Brain Consulting. Great name, Sharp Brain Consulting, which is a brain-based organizational development firm. And she is passionate about empowering traditionally underserved and minority communities and improving her local community, which is in the upstate. Prior to starting her business, I've known Jessica through her work in the nonprofit sector. She's worked for a number of organizations, but now devotes her time to this leadership development and consulting practice. And while she's doing that, she's also involved with the Junior League of Greenville, which I saw there's some Junior League folks on the call, the United Way of Greenville, and the Greenville Theater. She's a fellow of the Riley Institute and has been recognized in the upstate for her community involvement in a number of capacities. She has her master's in public affairs from the University of Missouri, and she is currently working on her doctorate, soon to happen, and it's a doctorate in leadership psychology. So with that, I want to pass the torch to my friend Jessica and welcome you to Together SC, and we want to learn all about what you're going to talk about today. So thank you, Jessica.
Thanks, Debbie, and thanks, Madeline, for having me today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I love that everybody is putting where they're from in terms of organization in the chat function. I love just seeing such a diverse kind of array of nonprofits, and there are a few that I've never heard of. And so I've written some names down, and I'm excited to do some research to learn more about the nonprofits that I am not familiar with. But it is nice to see lots of friendly faces, even though I can't necessarily really see your faces. I could scroll down, but to see faces and nonprofit organizations that I've worked with or volunteered with. So this will be really exciting. So when Debbie and I talked about this training and what it would comprise and what we would talk about, and this is really going to, I think, be kind of an overview, but also give you all some steps and some things that you can take kind of immediately, hopefully, to your organization around creating a board equity statement. So I'm going to kind of talk about this more from the lens of a board of directors, but know that these same kind of ideas and topics can obviously, be utilized from a nonprofit leadership, kind of utilizing from that perspective as well, because I know just from the names of the people on the call today that there are some board members, but a whole lot of nonprofit staff people. So know that, the tools can be used in very essentially similar ways. So I'm going to start with, essentially talking about the why. Why do we need to, to have this conversation around creating diversity, equity, and inclusion statements? So I'm going to ask you, utilize the chat function again. And I know that all of you at this point are well acquainted with that, but just kind of quickly throw into the chat function, why do you think it's important for a nonprofit specifically or a funder to have a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement? If you don't think it's important, maybe pause, because I'll let you know why it's important in a few minutes. But tell us why you think it's important and just pop in the chat function and let us know. And as you all are talking, or as y'all are writing, just know I'm taking notes to have take some themes, and I will kind of share some high level themes. Mm-hmm. So we've got putting into words our values. Transparency has shown up 2 separate times to let communities, employees, clients, members, just generally the community know that there's a support for this effort. It's a guide and a commitment that holds us accountable because, the diverse perspectives and voices make us a better organization. Values guide our organization to ensure that it's a stated priority. Because we all work in racist systems and need to be intentional about disruption. It's important to have it at the top so that at every level, DE&I is included, and I'll read just a few more. Organizational investment, making sure that because our work revolves around creating equality and equity for people, making sure that there's a statement around that. Gives clarity on where you stand as an organization. Action, that word has come up several times, to make sure there's action behind words. Accountability is shown up again here. Communicate the values. As a guide for your organization and recruitment and best practices. Katie's like, this is all good stuff, and it is. I'm like I feel like I need to ask Ben to send me the chat after, because these are all very, very good things. So, I mean, essentially everything that you all said is why, we need to have, statements around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Personally, I feel like it's our duty as organizations in the public sector. And Debbie mentioned this, but I've worked at several nonprofits. I sit on the board of the Greenville Theater, which is a nonprofit, and I am very committed to this sector. And partly because I feel like we have the capacity to, and we basically every single day are changing the world, right? We are, positively impacting individuals every day. And I feel like partly because of that, because I'm going to add on that, it is our duty and our responsibility to create equitable systems and organizations. In addition to that, Catherine from Public Education Partners in Greenville mentioned that we are, basically working in and operating within systems that sometimes are inherently racist, and sometimes by function of a whole lot of things, are not equitable around sometimes gender, around race, most specifically around things like, socioeconomic status. There are people who are having very different interactions kind of within the world. And all of us are seeing that from different perspectives based on our organizations. And so, we have a duty to make sure that our organizations are as diverse as possible when we think about volunteers, board members, staff people, but also that there's that piece of equity and inclusion. And we'll talk very specifically about equity and inclusion in just a second. Okay, so my sweet little Prezi, I'm trying Prezi. I don't know if it's gonna work. We'll see. It's like paused. So I'm going to get out of it for a second and come back in. But the good thing about just like generally, I know kind of the presentations and where they're going, so I can kind of reshare it again in a second. So sometimes technology is our friend and sometimes it's annoying, but we just kind of go with it and roll with it. So I'm gonna basically go through 8 what I think are really good steps and tactics to think about when we're thinking about creating statements, again, specifically from the board level, but really can be at any level in the organization. So initially, the very first step is you have to decide what your organization's commitment is to this work. And I'm having conversations with a slew of nonprofits right now who are having these conversations. Some of them are, their mission was always around social justice and equity and inclusion. Globe Theater is an example here in the upstate. They were basically founded to bring justice to the theater and to kind of intersect those two things. And so for them, like their commitment is just inherent to who they are. But there are other organizations who, when they were founded, when they were created and built, equity and inclusion and justice and diversity weren't necessarily explicitly a part of their work and their mission and their values, right? But for some of those organizations, they are, very much so like putting their feet in the, down and saying, this matters to us. We are investing time. We are investing funds. We are going to commit at every level to being equitable and inclusive. And then there are some organizations who, are not necessarily quite there yet. There are some organizations who feel like, okay, I know that lots of people are having these conversations and we probably need to do something around diversity, equity, inclusion, but either this hadn't been a priority and we don't know how it fits, or we know it needs to be a priority, but we really don't have any idea what this looks like. So really, as a first step, before you, in my opinion, really dig too much into any sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, is to figure out what is your commitment. How much are you ready to invest financially and in terms of your time in this work? So that's really the first step. And I'd recommend that conversation happen for sure at the board level, but also at the organization's leadership level. So first, decide how committed you are to this work. Then from there, step 2, in terms of, again, very specifically the statement, is figure out what kind of statement you are interested in, right? There are a flurry of examples of statements. You're going to see on here probably 2 or 3 that I'm going to give you as very specific examples. But you decide what kind of statement you want. So these are 2 very specific examples, and they're larger companies. I thought through a lot around the examples that we would use, and hoping, that there would be some examples from, either nonprofits nationally or organizations in the state. And I felt like, after doing some research and that sort of, and having some conversations, that these were really good examples for us to kind of dig into and to talk about. So this first example is from Kellogg, and we all know the Kellogg brand and who they are. And they have on their website, and all of these are on their website, and Karen, you will get a copy of the slides after this, but this is a very general statement, right? And it has more words than this on it. This is just a screenshot. But their commitment is very holistic, and they basically talk about how this is related to their overall mission and kind of their overall commitment to, to how they function as an organization, right? So again, theirs is very general. And Coca-Cola, they have a really, really strong diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of commitment and department and team. They have a whole web page that is specifically related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is an example. So Coca-Cola has both types of statements. They have a general statement that basically says, as a brand, Coca-Cola is committed to being diverse, equitable, and inclusive, and here's what this looks like for us as an organization. But a few months ago, and this was on June 3rd, so certainly, at this point about 2.5 months ago, they released a statement and a video that went along with it that was specifically in response to the murder of George Floyd and kind of the things that were happening after that, and depending on who you want to quote, what people are calling a moral or racial reckoning. And so, as an organization, you kind of need to decide, are we going to have just a general statement that says, as an organization, we are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it is a part of, how we function as an organization. So is that a statement that you want to write and release? Or are you going to kind of write a statement that's more timely and that kind of focuses on essentially the conversations that everyone is having because of, again, depending on who you want to quote, this moral reckoning, this racial reckoning that very specifically talks about this time right now where we are having more conversations about race than we have in probably, potentially ever, but certainly in a lot of years, and we're having some very transparent conversations about race. So first, decide what kind of statement you want. If you were to ask me my opinion, I'd probably recommend potentially both, or at a minimum, a general statement that really focuses on, as an organization, here's our commitment to. And we'll talk about another example in a few slides here that kind of combines those statements into 2. But decide what kind of statement do you want. As a next step, kind of step 3 here, is to be very clear on what these words specifically mean. We throw around diversity, equity, and inclusion, justice, like we just say these words, but the reality is not everybody is really clear on what they mean, right? So I'm going to define them in just a second. But again, utilizing the chat function, I wish we were in person and I could just say like, yell out what you think, but we can't, so we're utilizing the chat function. Pop in the chat function and share what you think, one or all of the terms mean. So say, I think diversity means this, but just, hop in the chat function and share your personal or organization's definitions of these 3 terms. And as I did earlier, I will kind of read some of them aloud. Inclusion, allowing people to feel comfortable in their identities. Diversity, accepting the whole employee. Equity, equal access. Equity is fairness, not being equal. I would like to think that equity goes beyond race issues and can include LGBTQIA+ issues. Diversity is variety at the table, so kind of taking away power and just having difference. Inclusion is, again, allowing everybody to bring their full selves, diversity, variety of thought, background, experience, lifestyle, values. I think diversity means a workplace that reflects community, different voices. Equity is about removing barriers. I'm going to show you an image in just a second that kind of hits at that. Diversity is defined by including all. Inclusion means all people, removing barriers. Inclusion is allowing all levels to participate and not just leaders. Inclusion is about sharing power. So these are all very good definitions. And I'm going to share with you a few definitions that I think. I'm going to show you some images and then some definitions, but I think as an organization, it's really critical that you make sure that as an organization, you are very clear on what these words mean. So these are, like, I think my 4 new favorite images here. And they're specifically around equity, but I think that they're very good images, and then I'll share definitions in just a second. So we all kind of think about inequality, you know, and this is this image up at the top, and it's obviously kind of a variation on the giving tree, but inequality is unequal access to opportunities. And I think we all see that every single day in the sector that we're in, regardless of, you know, if it is members of the LGBTQ population who are having very unequal access to things like healthcare, right? Or whether it is, you know, returning citizens who are having just unequal access and opportunity to things like employment because of their past kind of history, right? So we all see that in different ways based on our sector. So that's inequality. Then we go to equality, right? So, you know, I think for a very long time, we use this idea of equality, and we said that that's the goal. Equality is the goal. And equality essentially means that things are evenly distributed, right? You have probably seen that image where it's like people on these boxes and there's the fence and the game. And that's kind of an image that has been really thrown around a lot. And that kind of hits at this idea of equality versus equity. But I really like this kind of visual image of the fact that when we make things equal, that still doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is having the same experience, right? So that's why now we've really moved to this idea of equity. And it means that there are custom tools that identify and address inequality. And that it does mean that everybody isn't going to have the same thing. And that's okay. Right? You know, when we think about this concept of privilege, we can really understand that people are at different starting points in life, right? And so sometimes what I need to move forward is very different and potentially a lot less than what someone, you know, what my neighbor needs or what a friend needs or what someone else needs. So equity is this kind of idea of things being different, but they're different on purpose. And then justice, which I love, you know, justice is just one of my kind of values and things I really care about, is fixing the system. The language I often use is that I'm trying to blow up systems. Fixing systems so that we offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. Because if the systems weren't broken, equality would be fine. If the systems were fine and if the systems weren't inherently unjust, then it would be just fine to focus on equality. And so for most of us in our day-to-day work, we are thinking about equity. But I challenge all of us to really shift and begin to think about justice. And that is, it means things like policy and advocacy. And so we have to rely on our friends like public education partners. And we have to, you know, think about advocacy because oftentimes the systems, they need both us kind of here, but then they also need some things at the top to shift. But I really just like this image because I think it does a really good job of communicating why equity is the goal as opposed to equality. And so I'm going to show you some, and I love this image so much. So I'm going to show you, I went too far, some definitions here. And so these are pulled from different places. The inclusion definition is from SHRM, the Society for Human Resources Management, and the equity definition is from the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So diversity is about difference. right? The wide variety of shared and different just kind of personal characteristics among human beings. So for many of us, our goal is to make sure that our boards and staff people and volunteers are diverse and different and represent the communities and populations that we serve. So diversity is about difference. Sometimes you will see definitions that include very specific examples of air quotes diverse populations, and that's fine, but the problem is, one, you might kind of unintentionally forget some populations, but also, you know, because diversity just means different, what diversity really truly means for one organization may be different for another, because we are oftentimes serving different populations. There's overlap, but if, you know, our population is really about how we kind of want to define diversity. So inclusion, and again, I took this from SHRM, so it's really about the work environment, but inclusion kind of essentially has a very similar definition depending on whose definition you want. But inclusion is about the achievement of a work environment in which all individuals are treated fairly and respectfully, have equal access to opportunities and resources, and can contribute fully to the organization's success. I oftentimes talk about belonging as like the gold standard and the next step of inclusion. And belonging is about this kind of basic concept of, can I bring my whole self to work? You know, do I have to leave parts of myself at home? Do I have to hide parts of who I am? Or can I, you know, bring myself fully to work and be treated fairly and respectfully when I am at work, or, you know, when I'm volunteering or when I'm at the board table? That's inclusion. We're really kind of bringing everyone together so that they feel like they are very much so a part of the table. Because if we have a diverse board, as an example, but two people on the board feel like because they are the only people who look like them, they can never really share, or their thoughts and opinions are never valued, or whenever we talk about issues around Black folks, we always turn to the table and say, hey, what do you think? Then that's really not inclusion. And equity is, there are a lot of definitions, but this one's my favorite. Equity is about the state, quality, or ideal of being just, impartial, and fair. Right. So again, as a part of your work to create a board statement, again, before you even get to start writing the statement, you all need to be really clear on what these things mean to you as an organization and have a shared definition of these terms.
Jessica, there's a couple questions about how do you define justice? Did you see those in the chat box, or do you have?
No, I didn't. I got all like a little bit on a soapbox, which sometimes happens with me. And so I was starting to ignore the chat function a little bit. Yeah. So I think justice is very similar to equity, but justice is really about, in my opinion, the way that I kind of define it is about systems. And so equity, you know, I think about equity as more, you know, individual, more kind of groups of people, right? But that justice is about systems. And I think about organizations as systems. So when I think about justice, I am thinking about, you know, are we looking at, when we look from the top to the bottom of a system, of an organization, that it is equitable, right? That justice is like the next level of equity, and that from a whole systems perspective, from the policies to, you know, how we do business to our culture, that everything is about equity. And so feel free to pop in the chat function if that, and say like, yes, that helps, or no, it doesn't. But to me, I think about justice as a holistic way of thinking about equity, and it's like the next level of equity. Okay, so that is, can't remember which step I'm on. I think I'm on step 3. So step 4, you've done all of that kind of what I'm calling pre-work, and you are like, okay, it's time for us to actually start working on making this statement. So the next step is I need you to be inclusive about the process, right? So we just talked about inclusion. When you're thinking about your statement, think about who needs to be at the table for the statement specifically. So your executive director, CEO, they need to be there. They're probably more than likely the person convening the meeting. Your board chair most certainly needs to be there, and potentially other people from your board. You know, you may want to involve your full board. You may want to kind of involve, potentially depending on the size of your board, you may want to involve your board's executive committee, but think about which representatives from your board need to be at the table, but at a minimum, your board needs to be represented at this table and as a part of this process on either side, where if it's the board is working specifically on the statement, then it needs to be your full board and your executive director. But if your organization is doing it, then you need to have some representatives from your board. regardless of who's working on the statement, whether it's the board exclusively or it is the organization. You need to have a communications, if you have a communication staff person, that person should be there, because I mean, that person is so intimately involved with the language that you use, the type of words you use, the tone that you use. So that person certainly kind of needs to be a part of that statement, whether that means that, you know, they're there during the entire process, or you create some sort of a rough draft and then send it to them and say, does this feel like it's consistent with how we, you know, generally speak in our communication channels? And then if you have a diversity committee, I know some organizations who do have a diversity committee, some who don't. You know, Debbie mentioned that I'm involved in the junior league. We have a diversity committee. I'm our chairperson. When our board created a statement, I was very much so involved in that process with the statement. If you have a diversity committee lead, that person needs to be intimately involved as well. So again, you know, when you're just thinking about, okay, it's time to write this statement, just go through and think who needs to be at the table and are we being inclusive? You know, when I was doing some research to prepare for this presentation and a larger coaching program that I'll tell you about in a few minutes, one of the things that I read from the Council of Nonprofits talked about, you know, are there volunteers who need to be involved in this process? Do you need to potentially do a survey of or get some data or feedback from your constituents, from your clients, you know, however you know, program participants, depending on what you call them. So, you know, are there other voices that need to be at the table, even if they're not explicitly a part of the process? So I'm gonna go to the next slide, but I'm gonna just hop in the chat function in just a second. And Maurice makes a really good point that he believes justice is the result of an organization's effort, right? So you know, on the other end, we've done all of these things, you know, justice kind of on the back end. So that's a really great example as well, and kind of definition of justice. So moving on to step 5. So we've thought through who needs to be at the table, all of that. When it's like, okay, we're sitting here, we're gonna start working on a statement. You need to connect this to your mission and values for a few reasons. One, because if you all have decided that diversity, equity, inclusion, racial justice is important to your organization, then in theory, it should tie to your mission. It should connect to who you are and why you exist. And again, you know, I think, and I think other people think, that this sector kind of has a duty to be diverse, equitable, inclusion, and inclusive, but thinking about how does it relate back to your organization's values. And so again, as an example, and not talk too much about the junior league, but we you know, recently went through this process. We thought, okay, well, if this is our mission, how does this relate back to every single piece of our mission, right? And thinking about kind of really breaking down our mission and saying, okay, it relates back to this piece in this way, it relates to this piece in this way. These are our values. Okay, are all of these values diverse, equitable, and inclusive, right? What value do we not have that's missing? And again, how does all of this relate to our mission and our values? And so I'm going to read an example from PepsiCo, again, another kind of national brand that really, in my opinion, made sure that their statement and really just kind of their commitment to diversity and inclusion was really connected to their mission and values. So I'm going to read the statement. At PepsiCo, we recognize that supporting diversity and engagement is not only the right thing to do, it is the right thing to do for our business. This commitment is woven into our values and our guiding philosophy of winning the purpose vision, which recognizes that our company is strongest when we are a company of opportunity that embraces the full spectrum of humanity. That means building both a more diverse, a more inclusive workforce, and promoting what we call courageous engagement in our company and the communities we serve. I think another really great reason to connect this back to your mission is that if you end up having, depending on what type of organization you are, a member or a donor or, you know, a friend of the organization that begins to push back and say, why are we talking so much about diversity, equity, inclusion? Why are we having these conversations? Why are you bringing in a consultant and spending money? Why are we doing this? But if you've connected it to your mission, then it's really clear. The answer is very clear. Then when someone pushes back and says, I don't understand, well, you can say, well, it's part of why we exist. And in order for us to serve the communities we serve well, we have to do this, right? So you're just connecting it back to why, which kind of can shut down any sort of pushback that anybody has about why we're doing this work. Because as much as I wish that we didn't have pushback, I know we do because I have conversations with people who are pushing back. And so we need to connect this to our mission and our values so that it is crystal clear about why we are doing this work. And so at this point, I'm going to pause for just a second and kind of make sure, you know, that leave space for questions. And I know that at any point people can pop into the chat function, but now that we're kind of really getting into what I'm gonna call the nitty gritty of creating the statement, you know, feel free to at any point kind of pop into the chat function if you have any questions, but I want to make sure that you all know that you can do that. So if you have questions,
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I totally get the step 5 that you should connect to your mission and values. But what happens if you find that when you're getting into this work that your mission and values need to be addressed? Does that ever happen, or what do you talk about that?
Yeah, so I think that absolutely could happen, right? Is that when you start to dig into this, you can say, oh, something isn't right. And then I think that you need to go back to step 1 first and say, okay, there is a misalignment, there's a misstep, this doesn't match up, right? And so go back to step 1, which as a reminder was, what does your commitment look like? How committed are you to equity, justice, inclusion, again, as you've defined them? Because not that you're going to follow these steps exactly, but if you do follow these steps, then you have defined equity, you've defined equity, diversity, inclusion. So if you feel like there's a mismatch, go back to step 1. And if you feel like we are incredibly committed to this, and we feel like we have to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion because it's important to our sector, because we know that that there are people who are having very different experiences, because we know that we have to focus on this in order to do our work well, whatever kind of reason as an organization you come up with, because it's the right thing to do, because it's good for our business, whatever, you know, you decide as your reason. If you feel very committed, you might have to change your mission and your values. And I know that I'm like throwing some crazy things out here, right? Like blow everything up, but that's okay. You can, if you want to. There are people that you can pay to do that. You can pay me, you can pay Debbie, I think, you know, because like we have a duty to do this well. You know, when I think about, and I will try not to get on a soapbox because as I've mentioned, it's very easy for me to. But when I think about the imperative around this work, I think about the fact that, and I'm in Greenville, as you all know, I think about the fact that I work with freshmen who are reading on a 3rd grade reading level in 2020 in what is an exceptional school district. And that when I look at them, they are mostly boys and they are mostly Black and brown. So I'm looking at those students, and then I go and run to this other program that I work with, and I'm working with students in this same school district who will go to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford, who were in the exact same schools. We have an imperative. Like this is, we have to do this well. We have a duty. If we are going to be in the business of helping other people, we have to be in the business of doing it equitably and of asking ourselves constantly, who's missing from the table? Who's not here? How do we get them to be here? Do they feel included? Do they feel like they belong? So you might need to change your mission and values, right? You might need to do a board retreat, get everybody on Zoom and blow some things up. So I'm gonna pop in the chat function for just a second. Does that mean talking about diversity, does talking about diversity in any way continue to make white the norm? Not in South Carolina. If you were like in Appalachia, like I would say maybe we can keep talking about, you know, we can talk about this differently. But the reality is in South Carolina and really in most of the world, we can't keep thinking about, you know, that this is the dominant, the norm. It unfortunately kind of is right now, but we need to push back and change it. And I think that I've answered your question. If not, push back and I'll answer in a different way. So it's really a disservice if we don't, you know, do this work of shifting potential our mission, because we're often serving marginalized communities, our neighbors that experience things differently than ours. So we have to do this right because they're having different experiences. Okay, so the question, Anne's question is a great one. Please discuss the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion statement versus an affirmative action statement. So I think it would partly depend on what we're defining as an affirmative action statement, but I think that we used to use a lot of tools, probably probably 10 to 20 years ago. We use things like affirmative action statements. We use things like affirmative action policies. We use things like quotas. I think we shouldn't do those anymore. I'm happy to talk more about why I think that. But I think that to Ann's question, your diversity, equity, and inclusion statement should be, in an ideal world, comprehensive, so you don't need an affirmative action statement. It is now that diversity, equity, inclusion statement. So depending on who you are as an organization, your statement will say something like, as an organization, Sharp Brain Consulting is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. As a part of this work, we are committed to making sure that our board recruitment and staff recruitment is diverse and equitable. And, you know, blah, 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 more words. But I think I use that as an example to say, if your diversity, equity, inclusion statement is comprehensive, you don't need an affirmative action statement. And Anne, let me know if that answers your question. And is saying equity is not about getting the same thing, as we talked about, kind of looked in that picture. Angela is with Step-by-Step Reentry Services. We have diversity and inclusion, leveraging reinvestment of alumni as our employees. That's wonderful. In our organizing, we have diversion, equity, and inclusion. We have them as the same thing. And we need working capital inclusion to carry out the delivery of our mission. So for Step-by-Step, inclusion, like, it is inherent to their success. Without inclusion, they won't be successful. And that when the word diversity or active diversifying, I understand what you're saying, Madeline. So when we talk about, I sometimes push back when people say things like, oh, we just made a diversity hire. Please don't say that. So what Madeline's saying is, I'm worried that the word diversity or the act of diversifying implies that white is the norm. But here's the thing about diversity, because it means different. We may be, in some organizations, actually not talking about race when we're talking about diversity. Because diversity is broad, we may mean race plus. We may say, okay, we know that our population that we serve is 30% African American, 9% Latinx, 20% people with physical disabilities, and I'm just throwing out numbers, and 9% members of the LGBTQ community. So our structure needs to represent that. So because diversity is about difference, it is oftentimes about more than race. Now, I also want you to hear me clearly. We have a racial issue in our country, and certainly in the South. So we're going to talk about race, but because it means more than that. And to Madeline, the other thing I want to add too is, we are still in a place where so many of our organizations are dominated by white folks. And so it doesn't mean that it's the norm, but it does mean that they're just, like, if you count them, there are more of them in power. And so we do need to really push back. Lee Thompson is saying, can a manager be onboarded with DEI professionally, but personally be different outside of work? Okay, I'm gonna read that again. Can a manager be on board with DEI professionally, but personally be different? I'm gonna use my words very, very strategically right now. Maybe. You know, sometimes I say things that might make people mad, and that's okay, I think. I think that would be really hard. I think it'd be really hard. To be very, and I'm happy for people to push back, and we're having a little bit of a conversation, but we're fine in terms of time. I think it's hard for you to be, like, really, like, truly committed to equity, inclusion, and justice professionally, but not personally. I think it's hard, because I think when you start to really understand issues of inequity and justice, and when you really start to just have a personal commitment to this work, I think it's really hard to not be basically committed to this work outside of. yeah, I think it's just really hard. And I'm happy for people to push back, and we can talk through offline what that looks like. But I just think if you're really, really committed to this work, particularly the conversations I have with people, more specifically, just being transparent white people who are like, whoa, I didn't know how bad things were. This is crazy. And for those people, they're saying to me, like, I can't unsee this now. Like, it's all I see and I can't stop thinking about it. So to me, it feels like when you really start to dig into this, it's really hard to not have a full commitment to it. So, and thank you, Angela, for, you know, allowing me, pushing me to be open. And Quinn said empathy. I'm on this whole tangent about empathy right now. I'm doing a lot of research on empathy. Statement is great, but real conversations that are taking place can make the most difference. We're going to talk more about post-statement in just a minute here, Tricia. I agree that it is an integrity issue when your personal and professional convictions don't conflict. So again, I don't think that you can really be committed to equity and justice professionally. And then particularly because we also work so much, like, you know, you work, anybody in nonprofit doesn't work 40 hours, they're working more than that. And so for you to spend 40 plus hours committed to this work and then go home and like turn off a switch, I don't think that you really can do that. So we're gonna shift to step 6, which is action steps. It includes conversation. Somebody said a statement's great, but basically you gotta do more than that. I agree. So the best statements that I've seen, let me back up. And I'm gonna preface this because of what something said before I dig into this slide so much. When after George Floyd got murdered, and then there was essentially this racial moral reckoning, and all of these organizations, again, really nationally, were putting out statements and blacking out their like Facebook and Instagrams and that sort of thing. I heard feedback from very specifically a lot of Black people who were like, these set of words is fine, but like, what are you doing differently? I don't care about it. Some people were quite frankly angry about the statements because they said, you know, everything that you actually do is inequitable, but now you have this statement. And so unless you are prepared to, and again, this is why step 1 is what step 1 is. You got to decide your commitment, because the best statements include an actual commitment. And in an ideal world, they potentially are going to include action steps, right? They're going to really focus on how you as an organization will do this work differently. And we're going to talk about accountability in just a second. But, you know, essentially what Quinn just said is really hits on my point. Empathy and integrity to this work and to the action steps is commitment, right? Being really clear about who you are and what you're going to commit to. And Brene Brown, who's like my queen, I have this up here and I want to make sure I don't mispronounce it or misread it. She says that integrity is choosing courage over comfort, choosing what is right over came up with. It's like so nice to see some of my friends because I can't see y'all in person. Leslie, I miss your kids. So timelines. As I said, I'm gonna probably say it probably just one more time. It's not long enough. As you're coming back in, just pop something in the chat function that 1 or 2 things that you talked about, and it was not long enough. They never are, I know. So things that we can do in terms of accountability, timelines, setting up a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. I think that's really important. Accountability plan, a committee. I was a part of an organization once that I suggested, hey, should we have a diversity committee? And the person said, oh, well, that diversity should be everybody's priority. Well, it should be, but finance should be everybody's priority. And we have a finance team and staff people. So we need to have some people thinking about this all of the time. Keeping the focus, so publishing deadlines and a structured timeline and plan for getting things done. Written commitments to staff members, encouraging monthly or bi-yearly reviews. laying down measurable outcomes and reporting on data changes, regular check-ins with metrics, hiring Jessica as a consultant. Cynthia, you can do that. Board diversity, pay equity and recruitment, transparency in our community, making sure there are action steps. These are really great. So I'm going to stop reading them and go back to, so I actually won't go back to the slides because I want to be able to see you all, and there's only a few more words on the rest of the slides anyway. So step 7 is exactly what you all talked about, is creating an accountability plan. And you all have come up with so many different ideas of ways to keep yourselves accountable and just make it work for your organization, whether it's data, metrics, publishing a report, making it a part of every single board meeting, and maybe it's a part of every single leadership team meeting that you have a check-in about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Whatever it is, just make it both a part of how you do business moving forward, and you have to have an accountability plan. Quinn said, don't make a manufactured statement and then don't show up for anything. That's why this accountability plan is a really, really critical part of what you're doing. Financial accountability. Lori has a question that I necessarily can't answer. This is a Ben or a Debbie question. Can we include the chat with the presentation? Because there are really great things in this chat box right now. So that's a Ben and Debbie question.
We will definitely do that. And I think there's some really rich content here.
Yeah, there really is. So the last thing that I'll say before I kind of hush and be quiet in case you have any last minute questions is step 8 is don't let this be the last thing you do around race, diversity, equity, inclusion. And I'm basically saying, the same thing that we just talked about around an accountability plan, but make a statement, create a plan, and then execute the plan. And think about, look at your organization holistically, look at your staff, look at your board, look at your volunteers, look at your programming, and is your programming equitable? Do the students who, and I'm using students because I work with students a lot, do the students who are participating in your program on a scholarship have the exact same experience as students who are paying a full fee? If they don't, why not? Right? So look at every single part of your organization. Look at your policies. Do you have a non-discrimination policy? If you don't, step 1, that's your homework. Put a policy in place, right? Look at your website. Look at your social media. Is everyone who is on your social media a white person? Step 1, do something about that. Happy to help. But start to think about, how do you make sure that from the top down, everywhere across your organization, you are equitable? And Alyssa has a really great question. Can you some examples of statements and accountability plans? So when we send this presentation out, there are a few examples in there, but I will kind of pull those out, and I've got some links that I just keep for myself of some great statements. And then honestly, I don't necessarily know of an organization that has published their accountability plan, which is a separate issue, but I will kind of pull some examples that I think partly from this chat, but also just that I think are great to put into kind of an accountability plan. And then Karen said, and this will be really probably the last thing I say, is once you have your statement, it needs to be kind of part of every decision that you make. And moving forward as an organization, everything that you do needs to be with, Jamie Moon, who's primarily in Upstate, talked about this idea of equity lenses. So not even glasses, but like contact lenses. Everything you do moving forward needs to be looking at and thinking about, are we equitable? And are we inclusive and diverse? So please do a statement, but please, please, please don't end with a statement. The stakes are too high for us to have only words and no action. So I know that it's 12:59, but I'm happy to stay on for just a few minutes if anyone has any questions. If you don't, or if you're like, I said I was going to stay until 1 and I'm leaving now, feel free to leave since this is the end. But if you do have a few questions, I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes to answer any questions. And Debbie, I'm not sure if you've got any last minute things to share.
Well, no, but I thank you very much for your time and your enthusiasm around this topic. I see that Madeline in the chat box has shared the link to the Together SC equity statement. Thank you for doing that, Madeline. So we announced that not so long ago in our For Good Connections, and you can all have access to looking at our work. But yeah, we really appreciate your time, Jessica, and your energy, and see a lot of thank yous, and if everyone could give her a round of applause online, which is always good to see those hands clapping. Thank you for your time. And if anyone would like to well, I should say we will send a follow-up, which will include today's presentation along with the resources that Jessica mentioned, along with the chat box and some of the great ideas that were in there. So give us a little bit of time to compile that, but we will send it to everyone that registered for today's session. And I see a lot of people are sort of saying goodbye, but anyone that would like to stay on, that's a very nice invitation. Jessica, if anyone would like to stay for a few minutes afterwards and have a specific question, we welcome that. So with all that.
I can answer one of the questions. So Ann says that, you know, Together SC had guiding principles, or SCAMPO had guiding principles. It doesn't include DEI. Yeah, I think, you know, I think that Debbie will say yes. And there's a link to the Together SC statement in the chat function as well.
Would you like to add anything, Madeline, as we're saying goodbye?
Thank you for a great job. Thank you. Absolutely great. And I think the most important thing is what you said last, Jessica, which is the statement or the policy is the first step, or a first step, an early step in this work. And do not speak out publicly unless you're committed to seeing your organization and individually you're taking the following steps.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's basically what these statements are, is saying we will act, both organizationally and individually. And so be prepared to follow through on that. So thank you. I think this is perfect. And we're here for you guys. We'll be taking you through this work. We're working with you. We just did our statement. We've got a task force working on our plan. So we're learning on this together. And it is work that we as white leaders need to lead on. You, Jessica, and your colleagues, our colleagues of color, need to help us get there, but white people put the systemic systems in place, and so we need to take them down. So with that, thanks.
Thank you. Is there anyone that, I see a number of people still on, is there anyone that specifically would like to ask a question? You all are on mute, unfortunately, by the way, the very nature of Zoom, but is there anyone that would like to ask a question? You can put that in the chat box. Blow it up, as Jessica would say. I like that.
Well, and feel free, I will put, as we wrap up here, my email, put my website in the chat function. Feel free to send me an email if you've got additional thoughts and questions. Thank y'all.
You can also visit our website, which will include it's included on the on our Together SC website.